This morning I came across a post that was basically asking the open question: Is Bashar Assad, the Syrian dictator, a good example of secular democracy prevailing over, or rather a secularist prevailing over religious extremes? And this got into an interesting thread about secularism versus theocracy. Now, I'm a strong believer in secular democracy. I detest theocracy. And I think Islamic theocracy is one of the most shackling kinds of theocracy, and one of the most prevalent kinds when we look at countries like Iran. So let me make no illusions about it. I detest theocracy. It's just another form of dictatorship. What I also detest is the way that Bashar Assad, in particular, has been kind of exonerated by industrial scale distortion. I think in some ways the biggest cover up or the biggest mass deception of the 2010s decade was the way the Russian state media rewrote the Syrian war. So let's be very, very clear. Just a quick recap here of what exactly happened in Syria. Late 2010, early 2011. As with other Arab states, there was great discontent. People were unhappy about rising food prices, corruption, police brutality, high unemployment. These were the things that triggered Arab Spring, and Syria was no different. So the narrative that Russian state media would have us believe is that it was an Islamist uprising from the start. The fact is, ISIS only really got a significant foothold around 2014, when the war had already raged on for a couple of years. So, at the end of World War II, people in countries like Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, they went through all the atrocities committed by the Third Reich and the Nazis, and they were also subject to Soviet atrocities. There's a Katyn massacre carried out by NKVD forces of Polish officers. If you don't know, NKVD was the Soviet secret police at the time. They also committed prison atrocities as they were fleeing in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa in the east. They basically just exterminated all the political prisoners they had in Ukraine and Poland, and estimates are as many as 100,000 people may have been slaughtered. So this was the retreating NKVD forces. Now, why am I mentioning this in relation to Syria? I'm saying it because just as people in Central and Eastern Europe went through both the totalitarian systems, of Nazism and communism, Soviet communism, um, the Syrian people have went through two extremes of the brutality of Assad's forces and the brutality of Islamic fundamentalism, particularly ISIS. And I have a theory about this. I think the reason that ISIS is seen as the greater of the two evils is because Assad's brutality is pretty much entirely confined to Syria, whereas ISIS's brutality has been seen all over the world. Any normal person, when they see a vicious terrorist death cult lowering men into a cage to drown, or enslaving women sexually, or throwing gay people out of buildings, any normal person would be absolutely revolted by that. But I remember the time that Putin accused the West of supporting cannibals because there was footage of ISIS combatants apparently eating human remains. There was footage emerged of that. Um, well, the distortion with Syria is that the Islamist groups actually grew in significance and in power with the quagmire that developed in Syria from a civil war that Assad started. And whilst Russia may not have directly funded or created ISIS. You know, time and time again, we see this claim, oh, the West created ISIS. At best, it's quite a loose claim. The argument is that because the West opposed Assad, then they must have created ISIS. The reality is a lot more complex than that. And I think the reality is that ISIS just took advantage of the quagmire. Um, and there's a lot more facets to it. But to expand this theme a little bit, secular dictators. So the idea is it's better to have a secular dictator, no matter how brutal, as long as they contain Islamism. But Bashar Assad is not a religious fanatic. Neither was Hosni Mubarak, neither was Muammar Gaddafi, for the most part. Neither was Saddam Hussein. Yeah, all four men were brutal dictators. And of those, three of them were deposed. Assad still clings on. Because Gaddafi had a particularly violent end, he's now been martyrized, unfortunately. People conveniently forget that he was an erratic dictator responsible for severe human rights abuses, both during his time in power and during the Libyan War of 2011. But here's the problem I've got. If you sort of conclude, well, the choice is either put up with a dictator who is brutal, but at least he's secular, or put up with the Islamists. That sort of dichotomy, that two choice situation, it kind of insinuates that it's a bit bigoted, I think, towards Arab people because it kind of insinuates they're children who are easily led. Like, if they're not if they don't have a strong man leader, then oh, they'll just fall into the hands of the Islamists. I think that's a big insult to young Egyptians and young Syrians who have contempt for both. You know, the young Egyptians that were protesting in 2011, most of them were probably not hardline Islamists. They weren't members of the Muslim Brotherhood. They just wanted what people around the world want. And I accept that each of these situations are not exact carbon copies of one another. So Libya, for example, is a more tribal society than, say, Egypt or Syria, which are more urban and have higher education rates and so on. But I really think it's a false narrative to say that there's a simple choice of, or there should be a simple choice of either put up with the secular dictator and okay, he'll torture dissidents, he'll ban any dissenting press, he'll lock up journalists. At least he's not a religious fanatic. And frankly, you know, Western governments have been backing such dictators. David Cameron acknowledged this shortly after the Egyptian revolution when he spoke in Cairo that the West had, as a policy matter, backed up Arab dictators, and we still do in Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of geopolitical things that go on that go well beyond the realm of human rights. I mean, anyone that thinks Western foreign policy is guided solely by human rights, that's clearly not the case, and I'm the first to acknowledge that. But I do think it should be more of a feature than it has been. Um, but I think it's very insulting to say that if the Egyptians don't have a strongman leader. I mean, the tragedy with Egypt, of course, is that Sisi is just another Mubarak. He might even be worse. Egypt's went through such a turbulent 10 years. It had the revolution in 2011. Then you had the rise of Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, which was then overthrown in 2013. And then the rise of Sisi. And while Sisi has taken on the Islamists in Sinai, and I'm not going to criticize his government for that, you know, Islamists are a threat to the world. They need to be taken on. And I don't care if they're taken out. But does that justify locking up journalists? Does that justify the torture of dissidents? Does it justify routine police brutality? The irony with this is it actually galvanizes Islamist movements. So the idea that secular dictators contain Islamism, I think, is extremely misguided. In fact, the idea that dictatorships in general create stability, I think, is a contentious point of view. I think it may be true for a while, but sooner or later, I think fundamentally whilst there are cultural differences in the world, I think most people want basic liberties. I think there's a fundamental desire. Most dictatorships stay in power for a variety of reasons. So, in the case of secular Arab dictators, they tend to enjoy support and stay in power because they convince their populations if we leave power, if we don't cling on to power, then the Islamists will take over. And the thing is, there is some basis for that concern because in a lot of these countries there is a real Islamist presence. But it ignores the fact that there have actually been revolutions that have overthrown secular dictators, but they were not replaced by Islamist theocracies. I'll give some examples. Tunisia. Tunisia is one of the few success stories from Arab Spring. They got rid of their dictator, but Tunisia hasn't become a major breeding ground for fundamentalist Islam. There has been some Islamic State attacks there, but for the most part, Tunisia has respected minority rights, and it's one of the most advanced countries in the region as a result, one of the most progressive countries in the region. Sudan may be another example. They've got rid of Omar al-Bashir, although in the case of Bashir, he wasn't exactly secular. His regime did bring in some Islamist laws. Well, look at what happened last year. It wasn't violence free. Over 100 people were killed, but women played a very important role in the revolution. The archaic theocratic laws were overturned, and Sudan may finally be seeing some optimism. I mean, it's far too early to say for sure, but there are glimmers of optimism in Sudan. And this is a country that's been ravaged by war for decades and poverty. So I don't accept this argument that there has to be a dictator as a stabilizing force because I think that history shows sooner or later people get sick of it. If a dictator is locking up journalists, how does that take on Islamism? I would have no issue with a leader like Sisi if he was only tackling Islamic extremists. That's a problem. He's not. And I won't be surprised if 5, 10 years from now there's just a repeat of history in Egypt if there's another revolution that overthrows Sisi. I think Egyptians are tired of unrest, so they'll probably tolerate him for a while. But I really think this narrative of the stabilizing secular dictator or any stabilizing dictator is flawed because history shows that sooner or later people get fed up. There are some examples of dictators dying as old men, and an example of this, of course, would be Mao Zedong in China. He died in 1976. There was no major turmoil at the point he died, although it did mark the end of the Cultural Revolution. The same regime rules in China. Um, in other cases, when the dictator falls from power, there is chaos. And many people, given a choice between dictatorship and war, will choose the dictatorship. But what a choice! My point would be people might say this is very naive, but I think that there are some fundamental universal human desires. I think there's cultural differences. Certainly, a country like Afghanistan, where there are deeply conservative Islamic um, sentiments in the public, and in parts of rural Pakistan, clearly a country like that is not going to become secular democracy overnight. It may never be. And especially when some of these Islamist groups have shown their depraved nature in recent years. Of course, when the Islamists become the dictators, I mean, remember the Taliban ruled Afghanistan with an iron fist for 5 years. They're just as bad, if not worse. But I really dislike this idea that, and you see this in right wing American circles actually. I've seen right wing Americans praise Assad, and they're very pro Russia because they think that Russia and Assad are just the good guys taking on the Islamists. And unfortunately, Russian state media has managed to hoodwink a lot of people into thinking that. It ignores the fact that Assad began this war, and it ignores the fact that the likes of ISIS really only got a foothold in 2014. It also ignores the fact that Britain and France took on both ISIS and Assad. The airstrikes were aimed at both forces. So the idea that the West backs ISIS is nonsense, baseless, and people just churn out this line without providing any real evidence of it. So I think there needs to be a recognition that dictatorship is dictatorship, and wherever there is dictatorship, there will be basic human rights taken away, and sooner or later, people will get sick and tired of it. Even in China, where the Communist Party still has a huge amount of support and a huge amount of power, particularly enshrined by neo nationalism, you do see actually signs of domestic dissent. I'm not talking about human rights activists, I'm talking about ordinary people. For example, in Wuhan, there were ordinary citizens speaking out. These weren't human rights activists. These weren't seasoned government critics. These were just ordinary people who were angry and disillusioned with the cover up, among other things. So nothing will ever convince me that dictatorship is ever a good thing. It may be the lesser of two evils when it comes to, I mean, put it this way, if I have a choice of living under a secular Arab dictator or an Islamist theocracy, I would probably choose a secular Arab dictator because I've less chance of being tortured. But that doesn't mean the chance is totally gone. I mean, ISIS would probably cut my throat, right? As an unbelieving infidel. But a secular dictator, particularly if it happens to be geopolitically on the other side, would arrest me as a spy. So there's a risk either way. I hate theocracy, but I just think this notion that, oh, well, we need Assad to stay in power. And the thing is, he's got the upper hand now. That's no mystery. You know, it looks like Assad's forces, backed by Russia, is probably going to win this horrible, ghastly war. I think at this point, 9 years of war in Syria, over 500,000 dead, immense devastation. It's going to take decades to rebuild that country. So I would say the absolute priority now is peace. And if it means Assad remaining in power, then sadly that may be the only conclusion. But it's history cannot lie. Russian state media can distort this. They can say, it makes me cringe when I hear people make out Assad to be just a good guy fighting terrorists. This is a smear. The ordinary men, women, and children bombed from their homes, torn apart by barrel bombs, murdered in chemical attacks. I mean, RT's lies about the white helmets has been exposed. So I just think it's the biggest distortion in modern times is the distortion of the Syria war. And the reality is both Assad's forces and the Islamists have a lot of civilian blood on their hands. Neither side is innocent. And there's a lot more I can say, but I'll leave it there for now.